The abandoned golden retriever was crying, and the kitten came to comfort it in time. So happy. What happens when a heartbroken, abandoned golden retriever finds his only comfort in a tiny stray kitten? Just when you think their bond is the most touching thing you've ever heard, prepare for a heart-stopping moment where survival hangs by a thread, revealing the true depth of courage. Don't miss their incredible journey. Subscribe, hit like, and listen to the full story of Little Friend Now. The roar was deafening, a gut-churning vibration that shook the very concrete beneath Buddy's paws. Rain lashed down, turning the narrow alleyway into a slick, treacherous channel. Water surged, swirling around his legs, threatening to pull him under. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled backwards, claws scrabbling for purchase on the greasy pavement, but the metal grate was slick as ice. Below him, in the churning darkness of the storm drain, a tiny mewling cry pierced the din. Smoky. Buddy shoved his muzzle against the grate, whining, frantic. The water level inside the drain was rising fast, carrying debris, leaves, plastic bags, unidentifiable muck that threatened to engulf the tiny kitten. Smokey's cries were weaker now, desperate bubbles of sound in the growing torrent. Buddy could smell the fear, acrid and sharp, mingling with the stench of sewage and rain. He barked, a harsh, desperate sound swallowed by the storm's fury. He pawed uselessly at the heavy iron grate, his muscles straining, but it wouldn't budge. Another wave of water sluiced down the alley, higher this time, crashing over the drain entrance. It submerged the grate completely for a terrifying second. When the water momentarily receded, the mewling had stopped. Silence, a crushing, terrifying silence that hammered against Buddy's eardrums louder than the storm. He pressed his face harder against the cold metal, whimpering, his large body trembling uncontrollably. Had the current swept the tiny life away? Was he too late? The weight of failure, sharp and familiar, pressed down on him, heavier than the rain, colder than the rising water. He was alone again, truly alone, responsible for the loss of the only warmth he'd known in this cold, indifferent world. He lifted his head and let out a long, mournful howl into the tempest, a sound not of loneliness, but of utter, devastating despair. The alley walls seemed to close in, the rain a relentless curtain drawing shut on his hope. Just weeks before the storm drain horror, Buddy hadn't known despair like this. He'd known loneliness, certainly. Abandoned in this grimy back alley bordering a tired suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, the 80-pound golden retriever was a ghost of his former self. His coat, once the color of spun gold, was dull, matted with dirt and burrs. Ribs showed faintly beneath the tangled fur. His brown eyes, usually bright with goofy affection, were clouded with confusion and a deep, aching sadness. Buddy hadn't always been here. He remembered a house, laughter, the feel of a soft couch, the satisfying crunch of kibble. He remembered fetch in a green yard, the scent of barbecue grills, the small, sticky hands of children who had shrieked with delight as he bounded, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. But Buddy had energy, boundless and often undirected. He chewed things, shoes, furniture legs, the corner of a rug. He jumped, on people, on counters, driven by an insatiable desire for attention. He dug holes in the meticulously kept flower beds. His family's patience, frayed by the demands of modern life, had snapped. One day, the familiar car ride hadn't ended at the park. It ended here, in this desolate alley. The car door slammed shut, the engine roared, and they were gone. He'd chased the taillights until his lungs burned and his paws were raw, barking until his throat was hoarse. But they never came back. He learned the harsh rhythm of stray life. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing emptiness only occasionally eased by scavenging from overflowing dumpsters behind the local diner. Thirst was quenched by muddy puddles or leaky pipes. Fear became his shadow. Fear of loud noises, sudden movements, the echoing shouts of humans, the territorial snarls of other strays. He spent his days curled in the sliver of shade offered by a dilapidated fence, his nights listening to the distant city hum, punctuated by the lonely echo of his own whimpers. He was adrift, a creature bred for companionship, starving for connection in a world that saw him only as a nuisance, or worse, invisible. Then, one sweltering afternoon, came the inciting incident, though it felt less like an incident and more like a quiet miracle. A tiny scrap of fur, no bigger than Buddy's paw, emerged cautiously from beneath a pile of discarded cardboard. It was a kitten, charcoal gray with startlingly green eyes, skinny and tentative. Buddy, initially wary, expecting a hiss or a swipe, simply watched. The kitten, equally cautious, observed the large dog. There was no aggression, only a shared sense of vulnerability. Hesitantly, the kitten padded closer, emitting a soft, questioning meow. Buddy lowered his massive head, slowly, gently. The kitten didn't flinch. Instead, it rubbed its tiny body against Buddy's muzzle, a fragile gesture of trust that resonated deep within the heartbroken dog. He nudged the kitten softly in return. From that moment, they were inseparable. Buddy named him Smokey for his color and his habit of appearing silently like a wisp of smoke. Smokey, surprisingly bold for his size, would dart into dumpsters and emerge with tiny morsels, a dropped French fry, a crust of bread, which he'd push towards Buddy with determined nudges. Buddy, in turn, became Smokey's protector. His size deterred other strays, and his body offered warmth during the increasingly cool desert nights. A fragile ecosystem of survival and companionship bloomed in the forgotten alley. Buddy's despair didn't vanish, but it lessened, replaced by a fierce protective purpose. Smokey needed him. This tiny creature, also abandoned, had chosen him. This fragile alliance, however, was about to be tested more severely than Buddy could ever imagine, culminating in the terrifying ordeal at the storm drain during the sudden, violent monsoon downpour that swept through the city. Their shared vulnerability, their dependence, had just become their greatest danger. Surviving the storm drain incident forged an even stronger, albeit more desperate bond between Buddy and Smokey. Buddy, digging frantically at the edge of the grate with renewed adrenaline-fueled strength as the rain briefly lessened, had managed to dislodge a loose chunk of concrete just enough. Smokey, miraculously unharmed but soaked and shivering, had squeezed through the gap, collapsing onto the pavement, utterly spent. Buddy had nudged him, licked him clean with frantic tenderness, shielding the kitten's frail body from the lingering drizzle with his own bulk until Smokey's shivering subsided into exhausted sleep. The near tragedy served as a harsh lesson. Their alley wasn't safe. The storm had washed away familiar scents and landmarks, rearranged the trash piles, and left behind a residue of damp chill. They needed a more secure shelter, and finding reliable food sources became paramount. Buddy, driven by Smokey's near-constant soft mews of hunger, grew bolder. He started venturing further, exploring adjacent alleys and the edges of the residential streets bordering their territory. This expansion brought new complications. They encroached on the territory of a large, scarred tomcat named Scarface by the neighborhood kids, who ruled the dumpsters behind the Italian restaurant with an iron paw. Scarface tolerated no intruders, especially not a dog, regardless of size. Their first encounter was a blur of hissing, spitting fury. Buddy, instinctively shielding Smokey behind his legs, stood his ground, offering low warning growls but avoiding outright aggression. He knew a fight could injure him, leaving Smokey vulnerable. Several tense standoffs followed, usually ending with Buddy backing away slowly, forced to seek sustenance elsewhere. Food scarcity gnawed at them. Restaurant dumpsters were fiercely guarded, and residential bins were often secured tightly. Buddy learned to recognize the schedules of garbage trucks, timing his scavenging attempts carefully, but often came away with little more than greasy wrappers or coffee grounds. Smokey, though small, was surprisingly resourceful, managing to slip through narrow gaps in fences to investigate potential food sources in backyards, but the risk of discovery was high. More than once, Buddy had to bark frantically to distract an angry homeowner while Smokey darted back to safety. They also faced the threat of less predictable dangers. Cars speeding down the service roads behind the shops were a constant hazard. Buddy learned to flatten himself against walls, pulling Smokey close whenever he heard an engine approach. Then there were the humans. Most ignored them, eyes sliding past as if they were just another piece of urban detritus. Some were actively hostile, shouting, throwing rocks, or calling animal control. The sight of the white van with the municipal logo sent waves of primal fear through Buddy, dredging up fragmented memories of nets and cages from somewhere deep in his past. He'd snatch Smokey up gently in his mouth, a maneuver they'd practiced born of necessity, and bolt, hiding in the deepest shadows or thickest bushes until the threat passed. Yet, amidst the hardship, small moments of grace occurred. A child might sneak them a piece of sandwich crust. A sympathetic night shift worker at the diner sometimes left out leftovers near the back door, though Scarface often got there first. And then there was Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry lived in one of the small, neat houses backing onto the network of alleys. He was an elderly man, slowed by age, but with kind eyes. Buddy first noticed him tending his small garden, his movements deliberate and gentle. Sometimes, Mr. Henry would stand by his back fence, looking out into the alley, his expression thoughtful. He never shouted or threatened. One afternoon, he placed a small bowl of water just outside his gate. Buddy, wary but desperate, waited until the man had gone back inside before cautiously approaching. The cool water was a blessing. This became a semi-regular occurrence. Sometimes a small handful of dry kibble would appear alongside the water. Buddy remained cautious, his past experiences making him distrustful of human kindness. He'd watch Mr. Henry from a distance, noting the man's quiet demeanor, the way he spoke softly to the birds that visited his feeder. He saw the man looking directly at him and Smokey one day, a flicker of something unreadable, sadness, pity in his eyes. Buddy instinctively tensed, ready to flee, but Mr. Henry just watched for a moment before slowly turning back into his garden. Smokey, less burdened by past trauma, seemed more inclined to trust. The kitten would sometimes sit near the gate watching Mr. Henry, occasionally letting out a soft meow as if testing the waters. Buddy always stayed further back, a silent, vigilant guardian. He felt a flicker of hope, a tentative yearning for the safety Mr. Henry's quiet presence seemed to represent. But fear held him captive. The stakes felt too high. If this tentative truce was broken, if this small kindness turned sour, where would they go then? The memory of abandonment was a wound that refused to heal, making him shy away from the very thing he craved most, a helping hand. Their survival depended on their fragile bond and Buddy's vigilance, but the constant stress, the lack of food, and the approaching winter were taking their toll, especially on the little kitten. The change came subtly at first, then with the force of a slammed door. The relative predictability of their scavenging routes and hiding spots began to dissolve. Official-looking notices, stapled to telephone poles and taped to the grimy brick walls of the alley, appeared overnight. Buddy couldn't read the stark black letters, but the accompanying diagrams, stylized images of bulldozers and dump trucks, radiated menace. The scent of unfamiliar humans, surveyors in hard hats and fluorescent vests, permeated their territory during the day. They paced the alley, pointing, making notes on clipboards, their voices echoing strangely in the narrow space. Their presence made Buddy deeply uneasy, prickling the fur along his spine. He guided Smokey to deeper, less accessible hiding places, behind a stack of rotting pallets, under a dense, overgrown oleander bush whose bitter leaves discouraged even the hungriest scavenger. But the surveyors were thorough, their measuring tapes extending into every nook and cranny. Fear, sharp and metallic, became Buddy's constant companion again, eclipsing even the persistent pangs of hunger. Mr. Henry seemed aware of the impending change, too. Buddy watched him talking to the surveyors one morning, his posture stooped, his expression troubled. The old man gestured towards the alley, then shook his head, slowly. Later that day, Mr. Henry lingered by his back gate longer than usual. He placed down the familiar bowl of water and a slightly larger portion of kibble. He didn't leave immediately. Instead, he crouched down slowly, his movements careful not to startle. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice soft and gravelly. "Things are changing around here, fellas. Not good." Buddy froze, hidden in the shadows beneath the oleander, Smokey tucked safely behind him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to melt back into the urban landscape. The kindness in the man's voice warred with the ingrained fear of betrayal. Smokey, however, perhaps sensing the man's genuine concern or simply emboldened by hunger, crept forward a few hesitant steps, emitting a tiny, hopeful meow. Mr. Henry smiled faintly. "Well, hello there, little one. You're a brave fella, aren't you?" He extended a hand slowly, palm open, fingers still. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." This was it. A chance. A direct offer of contact, perhaps even help. But Buddy's trauma surged. The image of the car driving away, the echo of the slammed door, the memory of hands that had pushed him away. It overwhelmed him. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, involuntary, born of fear, not aggression. He nudged Smokey urgently with his nose, a silent command, "Retreat." Smokey looked back at Buddy, then at the outstretched hand, conflicted. But Buddy's fear was palpable, a tangible force. The kitten obeyed, darting back under the bush. Buddy met Mr. Henry's gaze for a fleeting second, saw the disappointment, the understanding, perhaps even a touch of sadness flicker there, before turning and melting deeper into the shadows, pulling Smokey with him. Mr. Henry sighed, a soft exhalation of breath in the quiet alley. He remained crouched for another moment, then slowly rose, picked up the untouched food and water, and went back inside, closing his gate with a quiet click. The moment the gate latched, realization crashed down on Buddy. He hadn't just retreated, he had actively rejected help. He had let his own fear dictate their fate, potentially costing them their only chance at escaping whatever disruption the notices foretold. He looked down at Smokey, who gazed up at him with trusting green eyes, completely dependent on his judgment. The weight of that trust felt immense. Curling protectively around the kitten, Buddy felt a profound shift within him. Hiding wasn't enough anymore. Passively accepting scraps wasn't enough. Reacting to threats wasn't enough. He had to be proactive. He had to overcome his fear, not just for himself, but for Smokey. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to find a way to bridge the gap between the alley's shadows and the quiet kindness offered by the old man. Waiting for rescue wasn't an option. He had to seek it, actively and deliberately. The point of no return had been crossed. His fear had almost cost them everything. Now, his courage, however nascent, would have to save them. He started watching Mr. Henry's house, not with suspicion, but with a desperate, focused intent. The days following Buddy's fearful retreat from Mr. Henry were fraught with escalating tension. The surveyor's visits became more frequent, replaced now by workmen carrying tools and rolls of bright orange plastic fencing. The scent of diesel fuel and disturbed earth hung heavy in the air. Early one morning, the jarring clang of metal signaled the arrival of heavy machinery at the far end of the alley network. A palpable sense of urgency gripped Buddy. Time was running out. His focus sharpened entirely on Mr. Henry. He began observing the old man's routine with meticulous care. He learned that Mr. Henry left for groceries around 9 a.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays. He saw the mail carrier arrive shortly after noon. He noted the times Mr. Henry came out to garden or simply stand by the fence, gazing into the alley. Buddy started positioning himself and Smokey where they could be seen, but not too close, trying to signal their presence without triggering his own flight response. He'd sit quietly near the edge of the oleander shadows, Smokey perched patiently on his back or curled beside him, hoping the man would notice their deliberate visibility. Mr. Henry did notice. He resumed leaving water and small amounts of food, placing them closer to the bush, where Buddy now consistently waited. He spoke to them softly from his side of the fence, never attempting to approach directly again, respecting the boundary Buddy's fear had established. "Big changes coming, boys," he'd say, his voice laced with concern. "They're clearing out all these alleys. Redevelopment, they call it. Nowhere safe left back here soon." The confirmation of his fears sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Buddy, but it also solidified his resolve. He had to trust this man. He began tentatively inching closer each day when Mr. Henry appeared. He still couldn't bring himself to cross the invisible threshold into the open, but he allowed the distance to shrink, holding his ground even when his heart hammered against his ribs. Smokey, sensing the shift, grew bolder, sometimes venturing almost to the fence line, rubbing against the chain link as if trying to bridge the gap physically. Their already precarious existence became even harder. The initial construction work, though distant, disrupted the stray ecosystem. Scarface, displaced from his prime dumpster territory by the noise and activity, became more aggressive, pushing further into Buddy's shrinking refuge in search of food. One evening, a vicious skirmish erupted over a discarded pizza crust. Buddy, protecting Smokey, received a deep scratch on his muzzle before driving the tomcat off. The wound throbbed, a painful reminder of their vulnerability. Smokey, too, began to weaken. The colder autumn nights, combined with the scarce food and constant stress, took their toll on the little kitten. His playful energy faded, replaced by lethargy. His breathing sometimes sounded raspy, and a persistent shiver ran through his small body, even when curled tightly against Buddy's warmth. Buddy licked him constantly, trying to impart strength, his worry growing into a sickening dread. He knew Smokey needed proper shelter, consistent food, maybe even medicine. He redoubled his efforts to find scraps, venturing dangerously close to occupied buildings, taking risks he wouldn't have dared before. Then came the dark night of the soul. A cold snap descended on Phoenix, unusual for the season, bringing biting winds and near-freezing temperatures. Rain returned, not the violent monsoon downpour, but a steady, soaking drizzle that chilled them to the bone. They huddled in their inadequate shelter beneath the oleander, the ground turning to mud around them. Smokey was alarmingly still, his breathing shallow, his fur damp and cold, despite Buddy's efforts to shield him. Buddy felt a profound sense of hopelessness wash over him. He had tried. He had faced his fears, tried to be brave, tried to provide. But the world was too harsh, the odds too stacked against them. The construction noises seemed closer now, the inevitable closing in. He looked towards Mr. Henry's house, seeing the warm glow of lights in the windows, a stark contrast to their shivering misery. He whimpered softly, a sound of utter defeat. Had he brought them this far only to fail? Was Smokey going to fade away here in the cold mud because Buddy hadn't been brave enough, fast enough? He pressed his nose against Smokey's tiny form, feeling the terrifying lack of responsive warmth. Despair threatened to swallow him whole. He had failed his family, and now he was failing the only creature who had shown him unconditional trust and affection. The weight of it was crushing. The morning dawned gray and ominous. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture and the smell of impending destruction. The menacing growl of heavy machinery was no longer distant. It was here. A huge yellow bulldozer idled at the entrance to their section of the alley, its engine a deep, threatening rumble that vibrated through the muddy ground. Workmen in yellow slickers were stringing up more orange fencing, effectively sealing off the area. Buddy's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. Smokey stirred weakly beside him, letting out a faint, pathetic mewl. Panic surged, hot and suffocating. They were trapped. The oleander bush offered concealment, but it wouldn't stand against the bulldozer. Running meant exposing themselves to the workmen who would surely call animal control. The white van was parked ominously just down the block. Buddy frantically scanned the scene, his mind racing. He saw movement at Mr. Henry's back gate. The old man stood there, peering into the chaos, his face etched with worry. He held a worn cat carrier in one hand. He was looking for them. This was it, their last chance. All the fear, the trauma, the ingrained instinct to hide fought against the desperate need to act. He saw the bulldozer lurch forward, its massive blade lowering towards a pile of debris perilously close to their hiding spot. He felt Smokey shiver violently against him. In that instant, something broke inside Buddy. The dam of fear that had held him captive for so long, protecting Smokey, ensuring the survival of this tiny creature who trusted him implicitly, became the only thing that mattered. He couldn't just wait to be discovered or crushed. He had to signal Mr. Henry, make him see them, make him understand the urgency. He took a deep breath, gathered all his courage, and stepped out from under the oleander bush, deliberately placing himself in the open space between their hiding spot and the advancing machine. He stood tall, ignoring the shouts of the workmen who had now spotted him. Then he did something he hadn't done since he was a pup trying to get his first family's attention. He barked, not the low warning growl or the mournful howl of loneliness, but a series of sharp, clear, demanding barks directed straight at Mr. Henry. "Look! Here! Help!" Mr. Henry's head snapped up. His eyes widened as he saw Buddy, then darted to the approaching bulldozer. Understanding dawned instantly. "Hey!" Mr. Henry shouted, his voice surprisingly strong, cutting through the engine's roar. "Wait! Stop! There are animals back there!" He waved frantically at the bulldozer operator, simultaneously fumbling with the latch on his gate. Buddy held his ground, barking continuously, positioning himself protectively in front of the barely visible shivering lump that was Smokey. The bulldozer hesitated, the operator peering down. Workmen started towards Buddy, wary but advancing. Just as they got close, Mr. Henry burst through his gate, the carrier swinging. "Get back!" he commanded the workmen. "They're with me." He moved quickly, purposefully toward Buddy, his gaze locked on the dog. Buddy stopped barking, trembling slightly, but didn't run. He watched the old man approach, seeing only concern, not threat. Mr. Henry reached them, scooped up the limp Smokey with surprising gentleness, and placed him securely in the carrier. Then he clipped a leash, materialized seemingly from nowhere, onto Buddy's grimy collar. "Come on, boy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." Buddy leaned into the gentle pressure of the leash, casting one last look at the menacing bulldozer, and walked willingly out of the alley shadows and into the light. The transition from the cold, muddy alley to Mr. Henry's small, warm house was surreal. The quiet inside was startling after the constant tension of the outdoors. The air smelled faintly of old books, lemon polish, and something comforting simmering on the stove. Mr. Henry settled Smokey, still weak, but now safely nestled in the carrier lined with a soft towel, near a heating vent. He led Buddy gently to the kitchen, where bowls of fresh water and nourishing food awaited. Buddy drank deeply, then ate, slowly at first, then with more urgency, as his starved body recognized sustenance. A visit to the vet followed shortly after. Smokey, diagnosed with exposure and a mild respiratory infection, received medication and was pronounced likely to make a full recovery with warmth and care. Buddy, despite the scratch on his muzzle and being underweight, was surprisingly healthy otherwise. He endured the poking and prodding with quiet patience, leaning occasionally against Mr. Henry's leg for reassurance. Life in Mr. Henry's house established a new, peaceful rhythm. Smokey, under the old man's gentle care, and fortified by antibiotics and regular meals, quickly regained his strength and kittenish energy. He explored every corner of the house, batting at dust bunnies and climbing the sturdy legs of the old armchair where Mr. Henry read his newspaper. Buddy, relieved of the constant burden of vigilance and survival, transformed. The frantic energy that had perhaps contributed to his abandonment mellowed into a calm attentiveness. He no longer chewed furniture or jumped excessively. His joy expressed itself in happy tail wags, contented sighs as he lay sprawled on the rug at Mr. Henry's feet, and gentle nudges demanding ear scratches. He rarely left Smokey's side. They curled up together in the dog bed Mr. Henry provided, the big golden dog a warm, protective presence for the small gray kitten. Buddy's coat, regularly brushed by Mr. Henry, began to regain its golden sheen. The sadness in his eyes faded, replaced by a soft, trusting light. He learned that hands could be kind, voices could be gentle, and homes could be permanent. Sometimes Buddy would look out the window towards the direction of the now demolished alley, a fleeting shadow crossing his face as he remembered the fear and desperation. But then Smokey would inevitably rub against his leg, purring loudly, or Mr. Henry would call his name softly, and the shadow would vanish. He was no longer Buddy, the abandoned dog. He was Buddy, cherished companion, brave protector, forever indebted to the tiny feline friend who had appeared like a wisp of smoke and shown him the way back to warmth, trust, and love. In the quiet safety of their new life, Buddy finally understood. Smokey hadn't just comforted him, he had saved him, giving him a chance to become the dog he was always meant to be. The blind man and the orange cat were always seen together, but the truth behind their bond left everyone in tears. The corner of Maple Street and Elm in the small Vermont town of Havenwood was, most days, a picture of New England tranquility. A weathered white-steepled church stood sentinel on one corner, its bell tolling the hours with a gentle, resonant clang. Across from it, a small park, its leaves now blazing with the fiery hues of autumn, offered a haven of green, dotted with benches worn smooth by generations of townsfolk. The houses lining Maple Street were a mix of modest capes and grander Victorians, each with its own well-tended garden, now bursting with the last blooms of the season, chrysanthemums, asters, and the hardy marigolds that refused to surrender to the encroaching frost. Number 12. Maple Street was a small gray shingled Cape Cod, its paint slightly peeling, its porch sagging just a bit. It looked perhaps a little neglected, a little lonely, much like its sole occupant, Mr. Arthur Parkinson. Arthur was 82 years old, a widower for the past 10 years, and completely blind for the last 5. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his hand resting lightly on the top of a well-worn wooden cane, his steps measured and cautious. His days followed a strict, self-imposed routine, a necessity born of his blindness. He woke at precisely 6 a.m., the internal clock honed by years of habit, still ticking even in the absence of light. He made coffee, the process a carefully choreographed dance of muscle memory, finding the can, the filter, the pot, the familiar click of the burner igniting. He ate toast, plain, because jam was too messy, too unpredictable. He listened to the news on the old radio, its dial set permanently to the local NPR station, the voices a comforting connection to the outside world he could no longer see. He'd once been a skilled carpenter, his hands capable of crafting intricate furniture, sturdy houses, beautiful objects out of raw wood. His workshop, a small shed behind the house, now stood silent and unused, filled with the ghosts of projects past and the scent of sawdust and linseed oil. The tools hung neatly on the wall, untouched, gleaming faintly in the slivers of light that penetrated the dusty windows. They were a constant, painful reminder of what he had lost. His wife, Eleanor, had been his anchor, his light, his everything. She'd been a vibrant woman, full of laughter and life, a gardener with a magical touch who could coax beauty out of the most stubborn soil. Her flower beds, once the pride of Maple Street, were now overgrown, a tangle of weeds and withered blooms, a mirror of the slow decay that had taken root in Arthur's own heart. After Eleanor's death, Arthur had retreated into himself, into the darkness that had already begun to claim his vision. The glaucoma had been diagnosed years earlier, a slow, insidious thief that stole his sight inch by inch, year by year. He'd fought it, with drops and surgeries and stubborn denial, but in the end, the darkness had won. He rarely left the house now. He had groceries delivered once a week, a service provided by the town's senior center. He spoke to his daughter, Carol, on the phone every Sunday, a strained conversation filled with awkward silences, and Carol's well-meaning but ultimately futile attempts to coax him out of his self-imposed exile. He knew she worried about him, but he couldn't bring himself to bridge the distance, the emotional chasm that had opened up between them. The silence of the house was a heavy blanket, suffocating him at times. He'd try to fill it with the radio, with audiobooks borrowed from the library service for the visually impaired, but the voices and stories often felt hollow, distant, unable to penetrate the wall of loneliness he'd built around himself. He was adrift, a ship lost at sea, with no compass, no stars to guide him. He was waiting, he realized with a chilling clarity, for the end. He had resigned himself to a life of quiet desperation, a slow fade into oblivion. The storm arrived on a Thursday evening in late October, a nor'easter that howled down from Canada, bringing with it a fierce, biting wind and a deluge of icy rain. The weather forecast had been warning of it for days, but Arthur, in his isolation, had paid little attention. He'd heard the murmurs on the radio, the snippets of conversation from the grocery delivery man, but it had all seemed distant, irrelevant. As the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the old house, Arthur felt a flicker of unease. He hadn't experienced a storm like this since losing his sight. The sounds were amplified, distorted, frightening. The creaking of the old house, the roar of the wind, the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. It all combined to create a symphony of chaos that assaulted his senses. He huddled in his armchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, the old radio tuned to the weather report. The announcer's voice, usually calm and reassuring, was now laced with a hint of urgency. Power outages were being reported across the county. Roads were becoming impassable. People were being urged to stay indoors. Arthur felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He relied on electricity for everything. His lights, his stove, his refrigerator, his connection to the outside world. He hadn't bothered to stock up on supplies, hadn't even thought to check the batteries in his flashlight. He'd become complacent, lulled into a false sense of security by his carefully constructed routine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then died, plunging the house into complete darkness. The radio went silent, replaced by the deafening roar of the storm. Arthur sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alone, in the dark, with no way to know what was happening outside, no way to call for help. He forced himself to take a deep breath to try to calm his racing thoughts. He needed to think, to act, to find a way to cope. He reached for his cane, his constant companion, his lifeline in the darkness. He slowly made his way to the kitchen, his hands outstretched, feeling his way along the familiar walls, the edges of furniture. He fumbled for the drawer where he kept the candles, a relic from Eleanor's time, rarely used. His fingers brushed against the smooth, cold wax, a small victory in the overwhelming darkness. He found the matches, his hands trembling as he struck one, the tiny flame illuminating the kitchen for a brief, flickering moment. He lit a candle, the soft glow pushing back the shadows, a small beacon of hope in the encroaching storm. But the relief was short-lived. The wind continued to howl, the rain continued to lash against the windows. He heard a loud crash from outside, followed by the splintering of wood. A tree, he thought, had probably fallen. He hoped it hadn't hit the house. He tried to distract himself, to focus on something other than the fear that was gnawing at him. He thought of Eleanor, of her warm smile, her gentle touch, her unwavering strength. He imagined her beside him, calming him, telling him that everything would be all right. But the memory only served to deepen his sense of loss, his awareness of his own vulnerability. Then, above the roar of the storm, he heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound, a cry of distress. It was coming from outside, from somewhere near the back door. He strained to hear, his heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Arthur hesitated. He was safe inside, relatively warm, with a candle burning to ward off the darkness. Going outside, into the storm, was risky, foolish even. He could slip and fall, injure himself, make things worse. He had no idea what was making that sound, and even if he found it, what could he possibly do? He was blind, helpless, alone. But the sound persisted, a plaintive, desperate cry that tugged at something deep within him. It was a sound of suffering, of vulnerability, and it resonated with his own pain, his own isolation. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't simply sit there safe and warm while something outside was in need. He made his decision. He would go outside. He would try to help. He wrapped himself in his thickest coat, a heavy wool garment that had belonged to his father. He found his gloves, his hat, his boots. He moved slowly, deliberately, his cane tapping out a cautious rhythm on the wooden floor. He reached the back door, his hand fumbling for the knob. He hesitated again, the fear rising up in his throat, choking him. He took a deep breath and opened the door. A blast of cold air and rain hit him, instantly soaking his face and hands. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at his coat, threatening to knock him off his feet. He shielded his eyes, even though it made no difference, a reflex ingrained from a lifetime of seeing. He heard the cry again, closer now, right at his feet. It was a weak, pathetic sound, a whimper of pain and fear. He knelt down, his knees protesting at the sudden movement, his hands searching the cold, wet ground. He swept his hand back and forth, his fingers brushing against wet leaves, loose gravel, the rough edges of the wooden steps. And then he felt it, a small, furry body, shivering uncontrollably, a tiny, fragile creature soaked to the bone and trembling with cold. A kitten. Arthur gently scooped up the kitten, his hands cupping its small, frail body. It was so light, so delicate, he felt as if it might break at any moment. He could feel its tiny ribs through its wet fur, its heart beating rapidly against his palm. He brought the kitten inside, closing the door behind him with a sigh of relief. The relative quiet of the house was a welcome contrast to the raging storm outside. He carried the kitten to the kitchen, the flickering candlelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He found an old towel, one of Eleanor's favorites, soft and worn from years of use. He gently dried the kitten's fur, his hands moving slowly, carefully, as if handling a precious, fragile object. The kitten was still shivering, but it didn't struggle, didn't try to escape. It seemed to understand instinctively that Arthur was trying to help. As he dried the kitten, he felt a small, sharp pain on its side. He investigated further, his fingers probing gently. He found a small gash, not deep, but bleeding slightly. The kitten must have been injured in the storm, perhaps caught by a falling branch or debris. Arthur's mind, for the first time in years, felt sharp, focused. He knew he had to do something to help this creature. He had to stop the bleeding, to warm it up, to give it a chance to survive. He remembered the first aid kit, a dusty metal box that sat on a high shelf in the pantry. He hadn't used it in years, not since Eleanor had been alive. She'd been the one who'd taken care of all the minor injuries, the cuts and scrapes and bruises. He'd always been clumsy, prone to accidents, and she'd always been there to patch him up, to soothe his pain, to make him laugh. He found the kit, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of the box. He opened it, the hinges creaking in protest. He found some antiseptic wipes, some gauze, some adhesive tape. He worked slowly, deliberately, his hands guided by memory and instinct. He cleaned the kitten's wound, the tiny creature whimpering softly as he applied the antiseptic. He wrapped the gauze around its side, securing it with tape. The kitten, throughout the ordeal, remained surprisingly still, as if sensing that Arthur was trying to help. He then found a small bowl, a chipped ceramic dish that Eleanor had used to feed stray cats in the neighborhood. He filled it with a little warm milk, the last of his supply. He placed the bowl on the floor, gently nudging the kitten towards it. The kitten, weak and exhausted, lapped at the milk with surprising eagerness. It was the first nourishment it had had in hours, perhaps days. Arthur sat beside the kitten, watching it eat, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the candle or the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. It was the warmth of compassion, of connection, of shared vulnerability. He had been rescued in a way by this tiny, helpless creature. He had been given a purpose, a reason to care, a reason to fight back against the darkness that had consumed him. He still did not know the storm. The rest of the night passed slowly. Arthur stayed awake, sitting beside the kitten, listening to its soft breathing, feeling the warmth of its small body against his hand. The storm gradually subsided, the wind dying down, the rain tapering off to a drizzle. The power remained out, but the candle provided a small circle of light, a beacon of hope in the darkness. By morning, the kitten, whom Arthur had decided to name Rusty for the color of its fur, was still alive. It was weak, but it was breathing steadily, its eyes closed in peaceful slumber. Arthur had wrapped it in a soft fleece blanket, one of Eleanor's old scarves, and placed it in a cardboard box, lined with towels. He managed to make himself a cup of coffee, heating the water on the small gas-powered camping stove he kept in the shed, a relic from his younger, more adventurous days. He ate a piece of dry toast, his appetite meager, his thoughts focused entirely on the tiny creature sleeping in the box. The power came back in mid-morning, a welcome return to normalcy. Arthur immediately checked on Rusty, who stirred slightly at the sound of his voice. He offered him more warm milk, which the kitten lapped up eagerly. Over the next few days, Rusty slowly began to recover. He ate, he slept, he purred. He explored his new surroundings, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He'd follow Arthur around the house, his tiny paws padding softly on the wooden floors, his tail held high, a tiny orange flag of defiance against the world. Arthur found himself talking to Rusty, telling him stories about Eleanor, about his life, about his carpentry. He'd run his hand over the smooth wood of the furniture he'd built, describing the grain, the joinery, the feel of the tools in his hands. It was a way of connecting to his past, of keeping those memories alive, and Rusty, curled up on his lap, seemed to listen intently, his amber eyes fixed on Arthur's face. The small gash on Rusty's side healed quickly, leaving only a faint scar, a barely visible reminder of his ordeal. He grew stronger, more playful, more curious. He'd chase dust bunnies across the floor, bat at dangling threads on the furniture, and pounce on Arthur's unsuspecting feet. He'd climb onto Arthur's lap, kneading his claws gently on his trousers, purring loudly, a rumbling sound that vibrated through Arthur's body, a soothing balm to his soul. Arthur discovered, to his surprise, that he enjoyed Rusty's antics. He'd laugh, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years, a rusty, creaking sound at first, but gradually becoming more genuine, more joyful. He'd play with Rusty, using a piece of string, a crumpled ball of paper, anything that caught the kitten's attention. He'd feel a surge of warmth, of happiness, a feeling he'd thought he'd lost forever. He started taking better care of himself. He ate regular meals, he showered, he shaved. He even ventured out into the garden, Rusty trotting at his heels, exploring the overgrown flower beds, sniffing at the withered blooms, chasing the occasional butterfly that still lingered in the late autumn sun. Arthur felt a sense of purpose, a sense of responsibility. He had to care for Rusty, to provide for him, to protect him. This tiny creature, this unexpected gift from the storm, had given him something to live for. He was no longer alone. He had a companion, a friend, a furry shadow that followed him everywhere. He realized with a pang of guilt that he hadn't spoken to his daughter Carol in over a week. He usually called her every Sunday, but the storm and Rusty's arrival had completely disrupted his routine. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Carol, it's Dad," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Dad, are you all right? I've been trying to reach you. The storm." Carol's voice was filled with concern, with relief. "I'm fine, dear. The power went out, but it's back on now. I have some news." He told her about Rusty, about finding him during the storm, about nursing him back to health. He tried to describe the bond that had formed between them, the way Rusty seemed to understand him, to anticipate his needs. Carol listened patiently, her voice softening as he spoke. She'd always loved animals, had always wanted a pet as a child, but Arthur had been too busy, too focused on his work, to consider it. "I'm so glad, Dad," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so glad you have him. He sounds wonderful." "He is," Arthur said, a catch in his own throat. He's saved me, Carol. I don't know what I would have done without him." They talked for a long time, longer than they had in years. Arthur told her about his daily routine, about Rusty's antics, about his tentative steps back into the world. Carol told him about her work, her family, her life in the city. The distance between them seemed to shrink, replaced by a renewed sense of connection, a shared love for a small orange cat. Carol promised to visit soon, to meet Rusty, to see her father again. Arthur hung up the phone, feeling a sense of peace, of contentment that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He looked down at Rusty, who was curled up at his feet, purring contentedly. He reached down and stroked his soft fur, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming into my life." The first few days after Rusty's arrival, Arthur had been content to stay inside, tending to the kitten's needs, rediscovering a sense of purpose within the familiar confines of his home. But as Rusty grew stronger and more adventurous, Arthur felt a growing urge to venture out, to re-engage with the world he'd withdrawn from. He started small, with short walks in his backyard. He'd hold his cane in one hand and let Rusty follow him, the kitten exploring the overgrown garden with boundless curiosity. Rusty would dart between the withered flower stalks, chase after fallen leaves, and occasionally pounce on Arthur's feet, a playful ambush that always brought a smile to Arthur's face. The first time Arthur ventured beyond the confines of his yard, it was with a mix of trepidation and excitement. He'd decided to walk to the small park at the end of Maple Street, a place he and Eleanor had often frequented in their younger days. It was a short distance, less than a block, but for Arthur it felt like a monumental journey. He dressed carefully, putting on his best trousers, a clean shirt, and a warm sweater. He even polished his shoes, a ritual he hadn't performed in years. He felt a sense of anticipation, a nervous flutter in his stomach, as if he were preparing for a special occasion. He held his cane in his right hand, and to his surprise, Rusty positioned himself on his left, walking a half step ahead, his body close to Arthur's leg. It was as if the kitten instinctively understood that Arthur needed guidance, that he needed a companion to help him navigate the unfamiliar world. They walked slowly, cautiously, Arthur's cane tapping out a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Rusty surprisingly, stayed close, his orange fur a bright flash of color against the gray pavement. He'd pause at each curb, waiting for Arthur to catch up, then proceed carefully, his amber eyes scanning the surroundings. Arthur felt a surge of gratitude, of amazement at Rusty's behavior. It was as if the kitten had been trained as a guide dog, yet he knew that wasn't possible. It was something deeper, something more intuitive, a bond that transcended the usual relationship between a human and an animal. He felt a sense of freedom, of liberation, that he hadn't experienced since losing his sight. He was no longer confined to his house, to his memories, to his loneliness. He was out in the world, experiencing the sights, the sounds, the smells, even if he couldn't see them directly. He could feel the cool breeze on his face, hear the rustling of the leaves, smell the damp earth, and the faint scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. He listened to Rusty's soft purrs, his occasional meows, the gentle brush of his fur against his leg. These sounds became his guideposts, his anchors to the world around him. He trusted Rusty, implicitly, to lead him safely, to protect him from harm. They reached the park, and Arthur slowly made his way to a familiar bench, the same bench where he and Eleanor had often sat, watching the world go by. He sat down, sighing contentedly, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Rusty curled up at his feet, purring softly, a warm, comforting presence. Arthur closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the park, the laughter of children playing, the chirping of birds, the distant rumble of traffic. He felt a sense of peace, of belonging, that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer alone. He was part of the world again, connected to the life that flowed around him. He had Rusty to thank for that. The sight of Arthur Parkinson, the reclusive blind man of Maple Street, walking with an orange cat at his side, did not go unnoticed in Havenwood. The small town, with its close-knit community and its penchant for gentle gossip, was abuzz with curiosity and speculation. Mrs. Higgins, the owner of the Maple Street Bakery, known for her sourdough bread and her even more sour disposition, was the first to voice her observations. "Have you seen old Mr. Parkinson lately?" she'd ask her customers, her voice a stage whisper that carried across the small shop. "He's got himself a cat, an orange one. Walks him around like a dog, no leash, no nothing. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen." Her customers, a mix of regulars and the occasional tourist passing through, would nod their heads in agreement, adding their own observations and theories. Some whispered that the cat was a stray, a feral creature that had somehow attached itself to the lonely old man. Others speculated that it was a specially trained therapy animal, a gift from his daughter in the city. The teenagers, gathered at the corner store after school, had their own, more fanciful explanations. "I heard it's a magic cat," said young Billy Johnson, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "My grandma said it's a familiar, a spirit guide sent to protect him." His friends, a mix of skeptics and believers, debated the merits of his theory, their voices rising in excited argument. The story of the blind man and his orange cat took on a life of its own, embellished with each retelling, becoming a local legend in the making. The most common reaction, however, was one of gentle curiosity and a touch of admiration. Havenwood was a town that valued kindness, compassion, and community. While they might gossip about Arthur and his unusual companion, it was mostly done with a sense of affection, a shared interest in the well-being of one of their own. Sarah Miller, a widow who lived across the street from Arthur, was one of the few who didn't engage in the idle chatter. She'd known Arthur and Eleanor for years, had watched them grow old together, had witnessed their joys and their sorrows. She'd seen Arthur's slow retreat into himself after Eleanor's death, his gradual withdrawal from the world. She'd felt a pang of sympathy for the lonely old man, but she hadn't known how to reach him, how to break through the walls he'd built around himself. She'd noticed the change in him, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way he held his head a little higher, the way he walked with a little more confidence. She'd seen him in the park with Rusty, the orange cat curled up at his feet, and she'd felt a sense of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, he was finding his way back to the light. She decided it was time to reach out, to offer her friendship, to let him know that he wasn't alone. She baked a batch of his favorite cookies, apple cinnamon, the same recipe Eleanor had shared with her years ago. She walked across the street, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She knocked on his door, a gentle rap that echoed in the quiet house. Arthur was surprised to hear a knock on his door. He rarely received visitors, aside from the occasional delivery person or the social worker who checked on him once a month. He cautiously opened the door, his cane outstretched, his senses alert. "Arthur, it's Sarah Miller from across the street." He recognized her voice immediately, a warm, gentle voice that he hadn't heard in years. He remembered her kindness, her friendly smile, her delicious apple cinnamon cookies. "Sarah, come in, please," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. Sarah entered the house, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings, the slightly worn furniture, the faded photographs on the walls, the lingering scent of Eleanor's lavender potpourri. She saw the changes too, the subtle signs of neglect, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the silence that hung heavy in the air. She also saw Rusty, curled up on the sofa, his amber eyes watching her with cautious curiosity. "Oh, he's beautiful," she said, smiling at the cat. "This must be Rusty." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Yes, this is Rusty. He's my companion." Sarah placed the plate of cookies on the kitchen table. "I baked these for you, Arthur. Apple cinnamon, just like Eleanor used to make." Arthur's smile faltered slightly, a shadow of sadness crossing his face. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very kind of you." They sat in the living room, Rusty eventually jumping onto Arthur's lap, purring contentedly as Arthur stroked his fur. Sarah talked about the neighborhood, about the changes that had taken place, about the people they both knew. She spoke in a gentle, unhurried way, giving Arthur time to respond, to share his own thoughts and feelings. She asked him about Rusty, about how they'd met, about how the cat had changed his life. Arthur, hesitantly at first, then with growing openness, told her the story of the storm, of finding the injured kitten, of nursing him back to health. He described the bond that had formed between them, the way Rusty seemed to understand him, to anticipate his needs, to guide him through the world. Sarah listened intently, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer unsolicited advice, didn't try to pry into his personal life. She simply listened, providing a safe space for him to share his story, to express his emotions. As Arthur spoke, Sarah began to understand the depth of his loneliness, the profound impact that Eleanor's death and his blindness had had on him. She realized that Rusty hadn't just provided companionship. He'd given Arthur a reason to live, a reason to reconnect with the world. She also learned more about Arthur's past, about his career as a carpenter, about his love for woodworking, about the joy he'd found in creating beautiful things with his hands. She learned about his daughter, Carol, and the strained relationship they'd had since Eleanor's death. "I miss her," Arthur admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know how to reach her anymore." Sarah gently suggested that he try, that he call Carol, that he tell her how much she meant to him. She offered to help him, to be there for him, to support him in any way she could. As the afternoon drew to a close, Sarah rose to leave. "Thank you for the tea, Arthur," she said, "and thank you for sharing your story with me." Arthur stood up, Rusty still curled up in his arms. "Thank you for coming, Sarah. It means a lot to me." He walked her to the door, his hand resting lightly on Rusty's fur. He felt a sense of warmth, of connection, that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He was no longer alone. He had a friend. He had a community. He had a reason to hope. Emily Carter, a young, ambitious journalist fresh out of college, was eager to make her mark on the world. She'd landed a job at the Havenwood Gazette, the local weekly newspaper, a stepping stone, she hoped, to bigger and better things. She was tired of writing fluff pieces about bake sales and town council meetings. She wanted to find a real story, a story that mattered, a story that would capture people's attention. She'd heard the whispers about the blind man and his orange cat, the strangest couple in town. She'd seen them walking in the park, Arthur with his cane, Rusty a half step ahead, guiding him along the familiar paths. She'd been intrigued, curious, drawn to the quiet dignity of the old man and the unusual loyalty of the cat. She decided to investigate. She started by asking around, talking to the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the people who had known Arthur for years. She learned about his past, his carpentry, his late wife, his gradual loss of sight. She heard the stories, the rumors, the speculations about the mysterious bond between him and Rusty. She realized that this wasn't just a quirky human interest story. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was a story about loss, about resilience, about the unexpected connections that can form between humans and animals. It was a story about hope. She approached Arthur cautiously, respectfully. She introduced herself, explained that she was a reporter for the Gazette, and asked if he would be willing to share his story with her. Arthur was hesitant at first. He'd always been a private man, uncomfortable with attention, wary of strangers. But there was something about Emily's genuine interest, her gentle demeanor, her respectful approach, that put him at ease. He agreed to talk to her. They sat in his living room, Rusty curled up on Arthur's lap, purring contentedly. Emily asked her questions, carefully, thoughtfully, giving Arthur time to respond, to reflect, to share his memories and his emotions. She asked him about his life before blindness, about his work as a carpenter, about his love for Eleanor. She asked him about the storm, about finding Rusty, about the gradual development of their extraordinary bond. She asked him about his loneliness, his struggles, his fears. Arthur, initially reserved, gradually opened up, sharing details he hadn't shared with anyone, not even his daughter. He spoke about the despair he'd felt after losing Eleanor, about the darkness that had enveloped him, both literally and figuratively. He spoke about the moment he'd heard the kitten's cries, the decision he'd made to help, the unexpected connection he'd felt with the tiny, vulnerable creature. He described the way Rusty had changed his life, the way he'd given him a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a reason to venture out into the world, a reason to hope. He spoke about the simple joys of their daily routine, the walks in the park, the quiet evenings spent together, the comfort of Rusty's presence. Emily listened intently, taking notes, capturing his words, his emotions, his essence. She realized that she was witnessing something truly special, something that transcended the ordinary, something that spoke to the deepest parts of the human heart. She also interviewed Sarah Miller, who provided further insights into Arthur's past and the positive impact Rusty had had on his life. Sarah spoke about Arthur's kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength. She spoke about the way the community had rallied around him, She spoke about the way the community had rallied around him, the way they had embraced him and Rusty, the way they had offered their support and friendship. Emily spent several days with Arthur and Rusty, observing their interactions, taking photographs, capturing the essence of their unique bond. She saw the way Rusty guided Arthur through the streets, the way he paused at curbs, the way he seemed to anticipate Arthur's needs. She saw the gentle way Arthur stroked Rusty's fur, the way he spoke to him in a soft, loving voice, the way he smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile, whenever Rusty was near. She crafted her article carefully, thoughtfully, striving to capture the emotional depth of the story, the subtle nuances of their relationship, the quiet dignity of Arthur's life. She wanted to do justice to their story, to share it with the world in a way that would resonate with readers, that would touch their hearts, that would remind them of the power of love, of connection, of hope. She chose the headline carefully: "The Blind Man and His Seeing Eye Cat, a Havenwood Love Story." She knew it was a bit sentimental, a bit cliché, but it captured the essence of the story, the undeniable truth of their bond. The article was published on the front page of the Havenwood Gazette, accompanied by a photograph of Arthur and Rusty sitting on the park bench, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. It was a beautiful, poignant image, capturing the serenity of their companionship, the quiet strength of their connection. The article was an instant sensation. It wasn't the kind of truth that involved a shocking secret or a scandalous revelation. The truth was simply the profound depth of Arthur's loneliness before Rusty and the transformative power of the cat's companionship. It was the everyday heroism of a man overcoming adversity, not with grand gestures, but with small daily acts of courage and resilience. The story resonated with readers far beyond the small town of Havenwood. The local television station picked it up, sending a crew to interview Arthur and Rusty. The Associated Press picked it up from there, and soon the story of the blind man and his orange cat was being shared across the country, even internationally. The truth that resonated wasn't about a miraculous trained cat. It was about the very human need for connection, for purpose, for love. It was about the power of a small act of kindness, Arthur rescuing Rusty, to ripple outwards and transform a life. It was about the simple yet profound bond between a man and an animal, a bond that transcended words, that transcended sight, that transcended the limitations of age and disability. The article detailed Arthur's life, his skill as a carpenter, the love he shared with Eleanor, the devastating loss of both his wife and his sight. It described his isolation, his despair, his near-suicidal thoughts on that stormy night. It painted a vivid picture of the moment he found Rusty, the shivering, injured kitten, and the decision that changed both their lives. The article didn't shy away from the challenges Arthur faced. It acknowledged his blindness, his age, his limitations, but it focused on his strength, his resilience, his determination to live a meaningful life despite his difficulties. It highlighted the small victories, the daily triumphs, the gradual return to the world he'd withdrawn from. It emphasized Rusty's role, not as a trained service animal, but as a companion, a friend, a furry therapist who had instinctively understood Arthur's needs and had helped him to overcome his fears and his loneliness. It described Rusty's unusual behavior, his tendency to walk a half step ahead, his pauses at curbs, his protective instincts, but it presented them not as magical abilities, but as the natural expressions of a deep and intuitive bond. The article concluded with a quote from Arthur. "I may not see the light anymore, but Rusty has brought a different kind of light into my life. He's given me a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to smile, a reason to believe that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope." The response to the article was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and phone calls poured into the Havenwood Gazette office from people all over the country, all over the world. People were touched by Arthur and Rusty's story, inspired by their resilience, moved by their unwavering companionship. The outpouring of support for Arthur and Rusty was immediate and heartfelt. The small post office in Havenwood was inundated with letters and packages, addressed simply to Arthur Parkinson, the blind man with the orange cat, Havenwood, Vermont. The postmaster, a gruff but kind-hearted man named George, took it upon himself to ensure that every single piece of mail reached Arthur. The letters came from all walks of life, from children and elderly, from veterans and teachers, from people who had experienced their own losses, their own struggles, their own connections with animals. They shared their own stories, their own experiences of grief and healing, their own gratitude for the companionship of pets. Some sent handwritten notes expressing their admiration for Arthur's courage and Rusty's loyalty. Others sent drawings, paintings, and even knitted sweaters for Rusty. One woman sent a beautifully crafted wooden cane inlaid with intricate carvings of cats and flowers, a tribute to Arthur's carpentry skills. The packages contained a variety of gifts: cat food, cat toys, blankets, treats, and even a handcrafted cat bed designed to look like a miniature log cabin. There were also gifts for Arthur: books, audiobooks, warm socks, homemade cookies, and jars of Eleanor's favorite apple cinnamon jam, made from the recipe Sarah Miller had shared with the community. The local businesses in Havenwood also showed their support. The bakery started selling Rusty's Biscuits, a special line of cat treats, with a portion of the proceeds going to the local animal shelter. The hardware store offered Arthur a lifetime supply of free batteries for his flashlights and radio. The grocery store offered to deliver his groceries for free, and the owner even started stocking a special brand of organic cat food just for Rusty. The Havenwood Senior Center organized a meet and greet with Arthur and Rusty, an opportunity for the community to express their support in person. The event was a huge success, with hundreds of people lining up to shake Arthur's hand, to pet Rusty, to share their stories, and to offer their well wishes. Arthur, initially overwhelmed by the attention, gradually began to embrace the outpouring of kindness. He realized that his story had touched people, had inspired them, had given them hope. He felt a sense of responsibility, a desire to share his experience, to help others who might be struggling with similar challenges. He started accepting invitations to speak at local schools, libraries, and community groups. He'd share his story, with Rusty always by his side, a furry ambassador of goodwill. He'd talk about the importance of resilience, of perseverance, of the power of human-animal bonds. He'd encourage people to reach out to those who might be lonely, isolated, or in need of support. He became a local celebrity, a symbol of hope and inspiration. But he remained humble, grounded, always emphasizing that the real hero of the story was Rusty, the little orange cat, who had rescued him from the darkness. With the increased attention and support, Arthur and Rusty's life expanded beyond their quiet corner of Maple Street. Their daily routine, once marked by solitude and a limited scope, blossomed into a vibrant tapestry of community engagement and newfound connections. The walks to the park became a daily ritual, no longer a solitary venture, but a social occasion. People would stop to chat with Arthur, to pet Rusty, to share a story or a smile. Children would run up to them, eager to meet the famous seeing eye cat. Arthur, with Rusty as his constant companion, became a beloved figure in the park, a source of wisdom, kindness, and gentle humor. He started attending events at the Senior Center, something he'd avoided for years. He joined a book club, listening to audiobooks and engaging in lively discussions. He participated in craft workshops, rediscovering his love for working with his hands, even though he could no longer see the details. He learned to knit, guided by Sarah Miller's patient instruction, and surprised everyone, including himself, by creating a rather lopsided but undeniably charming scarf for Rusty. He reconnected with his daughter Carol. She visited him frequently, bringing her children, Arthur's grandchildren, who quickly fell in love with Rusty. The strained relationship between Arthur and Carol began to heal, replaced by a renewed sense of closeness, of understanding, of shared love. Rusty, too, adapted to their new, more public life. He seemed to relish the attention, purring contentedly as people stroked his fur, posing patiently for photographs, even allowing the children to dress him up in silly hats and scarves. He remained Arthur's constant companion, his guide, his protector, his furry shadow, but he also became a friend to the entire community. Arthur and Rusty even started visiting the local elementary school, where Arthur would tell stories to the children, sharing his experiences and teaching them about the importance of kindness, compassion, and respect for animals. Rusty, of course, was the star of the show, captivating the children with his gentle nature and his uncanny ability to understand and respond to Arthur's cues. Their life became richer, fuller, more vibrant than Arthur could ever have imagined. He was no longer alone, isolated, adrift in the darkness. He was surrounded by friends, by family, by a community that embraced him, that supported him, that loved him. And it was all thanks to a small orange cat who had wandered into his life on a stormy night, a cat who had shown him the way back to the light. He often thought about how close he had come to giving up, to succumbing to the despair that had threatened to consume him. He shuddered to think of what he would have missed, of the joy, the connection, the love that he had found in his later years. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the article was published, a scare rippled through Arthur's peaceful world. Rusty, usually a creature of predictable habits, didn't come home for dinner. Arthur had been working in the garden, weeding the flower beds that Sarah had helped him to restore. Rusty had been nearby, chasing butterflies and basking in the sun. Arthur had called him several times, the usual routine, but Rusty hadn't responded. At first, Arthur wasn't too concerned. Rusty sometimes wandered a bit, exploring the neighborhood, but he always returned home before dark. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Arthur's anxiety grew. He called for Rusty again and again, his voice rising in panic. He walked around the yard, his cane tapping out a frantic rhythm on the ground. He searched the shed, the garage, the usual hiding places, but Rusty was nowhere to be found. He called Sarah, his voice trembling with fear. "Sarah, Rusty's missing. I can't find him anywhere." Sarah immediately came over, bringing her two grandchildren, Lily and Tom, who had become close friends with Arthur and Rusty. They joined the search, calling Rusty's name, shaking his favorite toy, a small feathered bird that he loved to chase. The neighbors, hearing the commotion, came out of their houses offering their help. Soon, the entire street was involved in the search, flashlights illuminating the darkening yards, voices calling out Rusty's name. Arthur felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He imagined all sorts of terrible things. Rusty hit by a car, trapped in a shed, attacked by a wild animal. He blamed himself. He should have kept a closer eye on him. He should have known better than to let him wander. The search continued for hours, but there was no sign of Rusty. Arthur, exhausted and despairing, slumped onto the front porch steps, his head in his hands. He felt a wave of grief wash over him, a sense of loss so profound that it threatened to overwhelm him. Sarah sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We'll find him, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "We won't give up." Just as Arthur was about to lose all hope, young Tom, Sarah's grandson, let out a shout. "I've found him! I found Rusty!" He was standing near the old oak tree at the edge of Arthur's property, pointing towards a thick cluster of bushes. Arthur rushed over, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He found Rusty lying on the ground, his body limp, his breathing shallow. He wasn't moving. Arthur knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch him. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. Was it too late? Had he lost his beloved companion? Then Rusty let out a weak meow and opened his eyes. He was alive. Rusty, it turned out, had been stung by a bee, a seemingly minor incident that had triggered a severe allergic reaction. Mrs. Miller, being a veterinarian, quickly administered an antihistamine, and Rusty, after a tense few hours, began to recover. The entire neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The scare, however, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the preciousness of companionship, and the ever-present reality of loss. The incident brought Arthur and Sarah even closer. They spent more time together, sharing meals, talking for hours, finding comfort and solace in each other's company. A quiet, unspoken affection blossomed between them, a gentle romance that defied their age and their circumstances. The following years unfolded like a tapestry woven with the threads of everyday life. The changing seasons, the simple joys, the occasional sorrows. Spring brought the vibrant blooms of Eleanor's beloved garden, now tended by Arthur and Sarah, with Rusty supervising from his favorite perch on the porch railing. Summer meant long walks in the park, picnics by the river, and the laughter of children playing in the sprinklers. Autumn painted the landscape in fiery hues of red and gold, a breathtaking spectacle that Arthur could only imagine, but that Sarah described to him in vivid detail. Winter brought the cozy warmth of the fireplace, the comforting scent of wood smoke, and the quiet companionship of Rusty, curled up on Arthur's lap, purring contentedly. Arthur continued to be an active member of the community, sharing his story, offering his wisdom, and inspiring others with his resilience and his unwavering spirit. He became a mentor to young people, a confidant to those struggling with loss, a friend to all who knew him. Rusty, too, aged gracefully. His orange fur became streaked with silver, his movements a little slower, his naps a little longer. But his amber eyes still held that same spark of intelligence, that same unwavering loyalty, that same deep connection to Arthur. He remained Arthur's constant companion, his guide, his protector, his furry shadow, a testament to the enduring power of their bond. Carol and her family visited often, their visits becoming a cherished tradition. Arthur's grandchildren adored Rusty, and he, in turn, seemed to enjoy their playful antics, tolerating their hugs and kisses with a patient forbearance that only animals possess. Arthur, despite his age and his blindness, remained remarkably healthy and active. He attributed his well-being to Rusty, to Sarah, to the love and support of his community. He had found a purpose, a reason to live, a reason to embrace each day with gratitude and joy. He knew that he wouldn't live forever, that one day he would have to say goodbye to Rusty, to Sarah, to the world he had come to cherish, but he wasn't afraid. He had lived a full life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, a life that had taught him the importance of love, of connection, of resilience. Years later, on a quiet evening in late autumn, Arthur sat on his porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, the cool air crisp and clean against his face. The leaves had mostly fallen, creating a carpet of rustling gold and crimson on the lawn. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Rusty, now a very old cat, his fur almost entirely white, was curled up on his lap, purring softly. Arthur stroked his soft fur, feeling the familiar warmth, the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. He could feel the fragility of Rusty's body, the slowing of his heart, the inevitable approach of the end. He thought back over his life, over the many years he had lived, the many experiences he had had, the many people he had loved. He thought of Eleanor, his beloved wife, his partner, his soulmate. He thought of his daughter, Carol, and his grandchildren, the joy they had brought into his life. He thought of Sarah, his dear friend, his companion, the woman who had shared his later years with such grace and kindness. And he thought of Rusty, the little orange cat who had wandered into his life on a stormy night, the cat who had rescued him from the darkness, the cat who had given him a reason to live, a reason to hope, a reason to believe in the goodness of the world. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, of peace, of contentment. He had lived a long and full life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, a life that had taught him the most important lessons of all, the power of love, the importance of connection, the resilience of the human spirit. He closed his eyes and listened. He whispered, "Thank you, my friend." He took a deep breath, then another, and then silence. He passed. Arthur passed away peacefully on his porch, with Rusty curled up on his lap, just as he had lived his life for the past several years. It was a quiet, gentle departure, a fitting end for a quiet, gentle man. Sarah found them there a few hours later when she came to check on them. She saw the peaceful expression on Arthur's face, the stillness of his body, the gentle rise and fall of Rusty's chest. She knew immediately what had happened. She called Carol, her voice choked with emotion. She called the doctor, the funeral home, the necessary authorities. But she didn't move Arthur, not yet. She sat beside him on the porch, stroking Rusty's fur, sharing their final moments together. Rusty, sensing the change, let out a soft, mournful meow, a sound of grief, of loss, of farewell. He nuzzled his head against Arthur's hand as if trying to wake him, to bring him back. But Arthur was gone. The news of Arthur's death spread quickly through Haven Wood. The community mourned the loss of a kind, gentle soul, a man who had touched so many lives with his story, his resilience, and his unwavering spirit. They also worried about Rusty, the faithful companion who had lost his beloved friend. Sarah, true to her promise, took Rusty in. He was old, and the transition was difficult. He missed Arthur terribly, wandering the house, searching for him, meowing plaintively. But Sarah, with her endless patience and love, comforted him, giving him the space and time he needed to grieve. The grandchildren, Lily and Tom, now teenagers, also helped, showering Rusty with affection and understanding. Rusty eventually adjusted, finding a quiet comfort in Sarah's home. He'd often sit by the window, gazing out at the street, perhaps remembering the walks he'd shared with Arthur, the familiar sights and sounds of their life together. He'd curl up on Arthur's old armchair, the scent of his friend still lingering in the fabric, a silent reminder of their unbreakable bond. The funeral was held at the small church on Maple Street, the same church where Arthur and Eleanor had been married, the same church where Arthur had found solace in his later years. The church was filled to overflowing, with people from all walks of life, all ages, all backgrounds, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had touched their lives in so many ways. Carol delivered a moving eulogy, sharing stories about her father, about his love for Eleanor, about his passion for carpentry, about his resilience in the face of adversity. She spoke about Rusty, about the extraordinary bond they had shared, about the way the little orange cat had brought light back into her father's life. Sarah also spoke, sharing her memories of Arthur, her gratitude for his friendship, her admiration for his strength and his kindness. She spoke about the quiet romance that had blossomed between them, a love that had defied age and circumstance, a love that had brought them both joy and companionship in their later years. After the service, Arthur was buried in the Havenwood Cemetery next to Eleanor. A small, simple headstone marked his grave, engraved with his name, his dates, and a single line: "He saw the world through the eyes of a friend." Rusty, accompanied by Sarah and the grandchildren, attended the burial. He sat quietly, his amber eyes fixed on the grave, as if understanding the finality of the moment, as if saying goodbye to his beloved companion. In the years that followed, Rusty lived a peaceful, contented life with Sarah. He became a beloved member of her family, a furry reminder of Arthur's presence, a symbol of the enduring power of love and companionship. The story of Arthur and Rusty became a local legend, passed down through generations, a cherished part of Havenwood's history. They were remembered not just for their unusual relationship, but for the kindness, the compassion, and the unwavering loyalty they had shown each other. The park bench, where they had spent so many hours together, was dedicated in their memory, a bronze plaque bearing their names and a simple inscription: "Love knows no boundaries." It became a place of pilgrimage, a place where people would come to sit, to reflect, to remember the blind man and his orange cat, the unlikely duo who had touched so many lives. The Havenwood Gazette published an annual article about Arthur and Rusty, keeping their story alive, reminding people of the importance of human-animal bonds, of the power of community, of the resilience of the human spirit. Rusty eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep. Several years after Arthur, he was buried in a garden under the blooming azalea bush, near the spot where he had often napped in the sun, a fitting resting place for a cat who had brought so much sunshine into the lives of others. Their story, however, lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love, of connection, of hope. It was a story that reminded people that even in the darkest of times, there is always light to be found, that even in the face of loss, there is always love to be cherished, that even in the quietest of corners, extraordinary lives can blossom. It was a story that would continue to be told for generations to come, a story of a blind man and an orange cat, a story of Havenwood, a story of love.